What if the wildest truth about the Vikings had nothing to do with war, but with what happened in bed when the torches dimmed and no one was supposed to be watching? Tonight, you'll lie beside a man too powerful to love, and two women who learn to escape him without ever leaving the room. This story isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It breathes through skin, through glances, through firelight on bare shoulders. Stay. Let the noise go. Let your body slow. And follow the warmth that lives just beyond memory, where sleep begins. The house smelled of smoke and salt and something older, like the pressed memory of wet fur, warmed skin, and fermented breath. Bjorn returned at twilight, his boots heavy with frost, his shoulders darker than the doorway he filled. The villagers did not cheer this time. They watched in silence as the two young women stepped down from the sled behind him, veiled in wool and secrecy. Inside the longhouse, the fire whispered low between the antlers, as if the flames, too, had questions it dared not ask aloud. The walls were lined with furs, stitched from fox, bear, and seal, softened by years of sweat and snow. Each pelt held a story, one of conquest, of gift, of skin peeled beneath stars. The air was thick, perfumed with pine resin, goat fat, and oil rubbed into beards with ritual slowness. When Bjorn passed through, he did not speak. He let the heat kiss his face and unfastened his cloak like a god returning not to triumph, but to hunger. The house had waited, and the house had missed his weight. No one knew the names of the new brides yet. One had hair the color of ash and seaweed, the other a golden braid like sun caught in ice. They moved with the quiet of girls who had learned early the weight of eyes. Bjorn did not introduce them. He merely gestured, and they followed him past the hung shields and carved posts, deeper into the timber dark of the home. Their steps barely touched the earth, as if they belonged more to stories than to flesh. There were older wives, of course, two of them graying silent, with eyes that no longer shone. They did not rise. They watched, through the steam of the stew, the fire, the years, how the young ones shivered slightly as they sat. Bjorn's long fingers unbuckled his belt with a tired elegance. This was not cruelty, it was ceremony. In his house, love and power slept in the same bed, beneath furs still wet with snow. And in the rafters, the silence gathered. Wind curled around the beams and licked at the candles, as if the air itself held its breath. Somewhere between the crackle of wood and the soft rustle of wool, the story began, not with war, but with warmth. Not with a scream, but a sigh. They were not alike, the new wives. Runa, the pale one, had come from a coastal village known for fish and famine. Her hips were sharp like worry, her smile always half swallowed. Fridas, golden-haired, bore the scent of southern meadows in her hair, honey and distance, thighs thick with sun. Their languages did not match. Their pasts were secrets. But that first night, side by side beneath the pelts, they breathed in rhythm. Two women plucked from different shores and dropped like coins into the same cold cup. Bjorn slept between them at first, vast and unmoving, like a bear hibernating between seasons. His chest rose slowly, tattooed with scenes of battle, gods, and serpents. His hand rested loosely on Freydis's belly, warm and possessive, while Runa watched the thatch roof above, counting shadows. In the dark, neither of them spoke. But bodies whisper things mouths do not. Runa's shoulder brushed against Freydis's thigh, and Freydis did not pull away. There were rules in the north, some spoken, many not. A wife was expected to warm her husband, to bear him sons, to tend to her hair and her loins with equal care. But there was room between the rules, slippery and silent, where desire made its own rights. That night, when Bjorn rose to piss in the snow, the two young women turned to face each other. It was not love that passed between them, it was something older and hungrier, something with teeth made of shame and silk. Freydis, bold like summer thunder, was the first to reach. Her hand moved beneath the furs, found Runa's breast as if it were hers by right. Runa gasped, not in protest, but in recognition. She had been touched before, but never as if her body were a question worth answering slowly. Their mouths met softly, like birds lost in fog, and for a moment the storm outside howled in approval. They knew the risks. Not all men forgave softness between wives. But in that moment, as skin met skin and warmth bloomed between bones, they did not belong to Bjorn, nor to the longhouse, nor to the gods watching from carved beams. They belonged only to the heat, to the hush, to the secret smile of the night. In the mornings, Bjorn washed alone. A basin of melted snow waited near the hearth, and beside it, a polished bone comb, still warm from the skin of another. He removed his tunic with the same care he gave to sharpening an axe, slow, deliberate, as if his own flesh might splinter. His back was mapped with scars, some clean like strikes of lightning, others like rivers that changed their course mid-battle. The women watched from behind the hanging firs, where light softened them into ghosts. He never asked them to touch him, but they did, each in their turn. Freydis would kneel first, cloth in hand, dipping it into the water, tracing the line of his spine. Her fingers lingered not in lust, but in reverence, as if scrubbing clean a god fallen to earth. Runa followed, gentler, almost afraid, her knuckles pale from the cold. Bjorn did not speak. He accepted the care, the small offerings of intimacy, like a king receiving grain during famine. His silence was heavy, but it did not crush. It held the moment still, like snow before it falls. Later, when he stood before the flames, hair loose and wet down his chest, his wives moved around him like tides, adjusting his belt, oiling his beard, brushing wolf fur from his boots. There was no command. They simply knew. It was their role to prepare him, and in that ritual of dressing, their power shimmered faintly beneath the surface. A glance held too long, a breath shared too close, a touch that lingered on the thigh longer than modesty allowed. Desire hummed in the quiet spaces, where language dared not trespass. The older wives said little, but they watched. Their eyes were not dull, only resigned, as if they had lived this scene before, 100 winters ago, and worn each of its roles. Sometimes, after the younger ones left, they would whisper warnings into the wooden beams. Words like, "Don't believe his stillness," and "the cold comes from within." Runa heard once, and didn't understand. Freydis heard too, and smiled. When Bjorn left for the forge or the training fields, the house exhaled. The firs sagged, the candles flickered, and the women returned to themselves, to laughter hushed behind palms, to braiding each other's hair with fingers still tingling from touch. It was then, in those quiet hours, that hands learned new languages, and the skin, freshly oiled and sweet with resin, remembered what it meant to be more than beautiful, to be worshipped quietly. There was no glass in the north, not yet. But the bronze dish in the corner, the one used for offerings to Freya, held a reflection just enough to stir vanity. Freydis found it first, after a night tangled in arms not her husband's. She studied herself as she untied the leather from her hair. She liked what she saw, a neck bitten red, lips still swollen with secrecy. She smiled. Not for pride, but for the strange peace of knowing her body had remembered something soft. Runa arrived with the morning milk. Her fingers trembled as she poured it into bowls carved with serpents and moons. Freydis turned, still bare beneath her robe, and caught the glance that passed, quick, guilty, hungry. "He didn't touch me last night," Runa said, voice small as a bruise. Freydis shrugged. "He doesn't always need to." Then she added quieter, "But you do." They ate in silence, though silence was never truly still. Their knees brushed. A foot curled over another's ankle. When Runa spilled a drop of milk onto her thigh, Freydis reached out, slow, deliberate, and wiped it with her thumb, then tasted it. The gesture lingered in the air like smoke, curling into something neither dared name. It was not rebellion. It was not affection. It was survival, stitched in desire. That afternoon, the long house filled with laughter, not from the women, but from the men who came to spar with Bjorn in the field behind the smokehouse. The sounds of clashing swords, barked insults, and grunts of triumph shook the timbers. Inside, the younger wives bathed each other. It was a game at first. Who could bear the cold water longer, who would shriek first. But under the guise of play, fingers wandered. Runa washed Freydis's back, tracing runes in the soap's lather. Freydis returned the favor, washing lower, slower, until the air thickened and breath became prayer. The mirror bowl sat forgotten in the corner, now full of milk, a silent witness. The reflection it held was not of gods, nor of warriors, but of two women, hair dripping, eyes locked, skin steaming against skin. They were not wives, not possessions, not ornaments. In that moment, they were storm and ember, hunger and haven. The spell had been cast, and the house, thick with pelts and prophecy, held its breath once more. Bjorn returned that night smelling of iron and sweat, with blood crusted at the corners of his fingernails, not from battle but from training. He had split a young man's lip open and laughed about it, lifting the boy afterward like a brother, then walking home alone. When he entered the longhouse, he was quiet, not from tiredness, but from a silence cultivated like land, something measured, intentional, fertile in its own way. He did not look at his wives as he undressed. He expected them to come. They did. First Freydis, bold and golden as always, knelt to unlace his boots, letting her hair brush against his thighs like breath. Then Runa, slower, more cautious, removed the wolfskin cloak from his shoulders and folded it neatly, her eyes on the ground. Bjorn sat before the fire, and they circled him like flames, not chaotic, but with rhythm. This was not foreplay. This was order. And within order, they had learned to leave tiny rebellions. A slow drag of a finger across his ribs, a second too long holding his gaze, a mouth pressed not in obedience, but in memory. When he finally took them to bed, he did so without words. Freydis straddled him first, as expected, the sun before the storm. Her movements were confident, practiced, beautiful. But Bjorn's eyes drifted past her to where Runa sat watching, pale knees drawn to her chest, mouth slightly open. He held out a hand. She hesitated, then approached, crawling across the furs. He did not pull her into the act. He placed her hand upon Freydis's hip, guiding it as if carving a rune. A shiver passed through all three of them, though none spoke its name. The night was layered in sweat, moans muffled by fur, and the wet, soft rhythm of skin meeting skin. Bjorn gave himself fully, not out of lust, but to reassert his place, his claim, his dominance dressed in intimacy. But when he slept, it was not in the center. It was Freydis who curled around Runa afterward, arms laced over her belly, lips brushing her ear with a tenderness that had no ritual, no rule. Bjorn snored with his back turned to them, unaware, or pretending to be, of the warmth blooming where his body could not reach. Outside, the snow whispered against the door like a secret no one dared say aloud. And within, beneath the pelts, two women shared warmth the way one shares breath after drowning, not to survive, but to remember what it feels like to be alive. It was rare for Bjorn to host a feast, but the arrival of spring and the naming of his first son from an older wife demanded celebration. The longhouse swelled with bodies, warriors, farmers, priestesses, and a traveling scold whose lyre had more scars than his face. Freydis prepared herself like a bride again, twisting her golden hair into coils, dusting her collarbone with ash and powdered birch. Runa wore red for the first time, a stolen scrap of cloth sewn into her tunic by one of the older wives. Neither knew what this night would reveal. At the head of the table, Bjorn sat wide-legged and regal, a drinking horn in one hand and roasted boar in the other. His laughter filled the hall, deep and generous, the kind that made men lean closer and women smile with closed lips. He spoke of raids and rivers, of gods who came in dreams and wounds that smelled like victory. But his eyes, they wandered, and more than once they settled on Runa, lingering just a moment longer than the tales demanded. Freydis noticed, of course. She noticed everything. The skald sang a story of Freya and her lovers, of beauty, betrayal, and a necklace so powerful it cost 4 nights in 4 beds. The room grew quiet with the rhythm of the tale. Some eyes turned to Freydis, adorned in gold, others to Runa, quiet in her crimson. And somewhere in the story, beneath the cords and stairs, Freydis reached beneath the table and placed her hand on Runa's thigh, a gesture not of dominance, but of warning, or protection, or both. Later, when the guests slept drunk on hay and memory, Bjorn called only Runa to his bed. The others did not follow. He spoke to her softly for the first time, asked her of her mother's name, her favorite smell, whether she had dreamed of the sea. Runa answered as if each word were a stone taken from her chest. Then he touched her, not like before, not to conquer, but to discover, as if her body were a language he had never truly heard. That night, Friday sat by the fire, combing her hair with fingers that trembled. Her thighs still remembered Runa's heat. Her chest ached with a jealousy she did not name, not of Bjorn, but of what was shared between them in the dark. She did not cry. She simply added another braid to her hair, a braid she would not undo, not even in sleep. Runa did not speak the next morning. She moved through the longhouse like smoke, thin, curling, ungraspable. Her body bore no marks, but her silence said more than bruises ever could. She fed the hearth with peat, stirred the pot of barley and bone, and when Fridas reached for her waist in passing, she did not lean in. She simply kept walking. Fridas watched the distance form like frost on a window, quiet, slow, and suddenly there. Bjorn, meanwhile, was in a generous mood. He gifted the older wives a silver brooch each and told Fridas she looked like spring. But it was Runa he praised at breakfast, with a voice too soft to be innocent. "You listen when the house speaks," he said, watching her with something almost like affection. Runa did not meet his eyes. She bowed her head slightly, and that gesture, so small, so practiced, sent something bitter down Freydis's throat, as if she had swallowed ash. By midday, the women bathed together again, as custom dictated. But the room felt colder. The basin steamed, yet no warmth passed between them. Fridas washed her arms with brisk strokes, her skin pinking from the heat, while Runa washed slowly, deliberately, as if her hands belonged to someone else. "Did he hurt you?" Fridas asked, not out of concern, but something sharper. Runa did not answer. Instead, she cupped water and let it fall over her breast like silence falling over a song. The older wives exchanged glances near the doorway. They had seen this pattern before, the new wife favored, the bond between women fraying under the weight of attention. But this time, it was different. There was something in Runa's stillness that felt like waiting, not surrender. As if her silence was not emptiness, but a container for something blooming dark and deliberate beneath the skin. That night, as Bjorn drank alone by the fire, Fridas found a small dish of ash and crushed elderberry beneath her pillow. A charm, a curse, or a warning. She didn't ask who had placed it there. She simply took a finger, dabbed it on her tongue, and swallowed. If Runa wanted a war of whispers and symbols, Fridas would answer in kind. The longhouse had housed many kinds of battles. This one would be fought without swords. Spring meant planting. The earth softened, and the villagers bent their backs to it, sowing seeds with songs passed down through grandmothers and ghosts. But in the longhouse, another kind of planting was whispered about, of wombs and omens, of blood withheld or expected. One of the older wives, brittle and wise, declared the signs clear. A child was on the way. But whose? And in whom? Fridas heard the rumor first, carried on the breath of a girl who traded eggs for honey. It struck her like a cold nail, sharp and immediate. Her hands went instinctively to her belly, flat and firm. She counted backward in her head, then forward. Runa had been with Bjorn more than once now, and the timing, Freydis's stomach twisted, not with jealousy, but with the bitter ache of uncertainty. Not knowing was worse than losing. Bjorn didn't ask. He simply began to touch Runa more in public, his hand on her hip, his fingers brushing her braid, his voice dropping when he spoke to her as if afraid to break something precious. Runa remained silent, her face unreadable. But at night, alone in the firs, she pressed her hands to her belly and whispered words no one taught her. They were not prayers. They were bargains. Freydis watched all of this from the edges, her beauty undimmed but her certainty fraying. She began to spend time with the priestess who tended the sacred stones, asking questions about herbs, about heat, about endings. There is no plant that undoes desire, the priestess said, pressing a sprig of yarrow into Freydis's palm, but there are many that soften the path it walks. Freydis nodded, not sure what she meant to do with that knowledge, only knowing she needed it. The child, if there was one, had become more than flesh. It was a symbol now, of favor, of legacy, of rank within the house. And symbols in the north were never left alone for long. They were fed or they were burned. Freydis lit a candle that night with shaking hands, her eyes on Runa across the room, curled into herself like a shell. And beneath her breath, she made her own bargain, not with gods, but with whatever part of herself had not yet turned to stone. The long house had its own rhythm, a breath that moved between walls, through fur and flame into skin. And that rhythm had changed. No one said it aloud, but something had fractured. The meals were quieter, the footsteps slower. Even the dogs sensed it, curling beneath benches instead of barking at passers-by. Bjorn remained unchanged, or so it seemed, loud in the fields, warm in the hole, dominant in bed. But there was a tension to his movements now, a stiffness in his hands, like a man gripping a sword too tightly, too long. Freydis stopped smiling. Not in defiance. She simply no longer needed to. Her beauty no longer belonged to seduction. It had become armor, sharp at the edges, gleaming cold. She wore her hair looser now, and yet somehow more severe. When she spoke, it was with careful syllables, each word a blade. Runa, by contrast, had grown softer, her steps quieter, her eyes downcast not in fear, but calculation. She no longer flinched when Bjorn entered a room. She knew her place, and how fragile that place could be. They rarely touched anymore. Freydis and Runa had once shared warmth, glances, even breath. Now they passed like wind through trees, aware but distant. Yet the memory of their closeness hung in the air like incense that wouldn't fade. Freydis felt it when she lay alone at night, her thighs cold, her heart thudding like hooves in snow. Runa felt it when she brushed her hair and found a golden strand tangled in her own. Desire, once blooming, had turned brittle, but it had not died. One night, Freydis approached her. not with anger, not with grief, simply with silence. They stood beside the hearth, the only light from embers. "If you carry his child," Fridas said, "do not forget the part of you that was mine." Runa looked up. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached for Freydis's hand. Their fingers touched, brief, delicate, unsure, like two leaves brushing mid-fall. Then Freydis walked away. The silence was not cruel. It was heavier than that. It was what remained when all weapons had been sheathed, and the war still lived inside the chest. Bjorn, sleeping nearby, never stirred. He had conquered nations, yes, but he did not know how to read the battlefield carved in glances between women who had once loved the same dark. That summer was hotter than any in memory. The river receded early, leaving sharp stones and the bones of fish in its wake. The villagers whispered of omens, that the gods were sweating, or that hell had opened her mouth too wide. Inside the longhouse, the heat pressed into skin, into dreams, into places not meant to be named. The furs were cast aside. Bodies gleamed with salt and breath. And still, no one spoke of what had shifted. Bjorn took to bathing at night now, standing naked in the moonlight near the well. His body, thick and marked, gleamed like a creature pulled from old myths. Freydis watched him once, from behind the slats of the storehouse. Not with longing, with study. She noted the way he traced the scar across his stomach, how he sighed when the water hit his neck, how he closed his eyes as if remembering someone who didn't exist anymore. She did not love him. She was not sure she ever had. Runa began walking to the priestess alone. She claimed to be learning about herbs, but her hands trembled when she returned, and sometimes she smelled faintly of smoke and ash bark. Freydis asked nothing, but one afternoon, while washing garments, she found a small bundle hidden in Runa's cloak, dried yew, threads of bloodroot, and something black and soft, wrapped in cloth. A charm, not for conception, for prevention. Freydis said nothing. She simply refolded it and placed it back where she found it. The next evening, as the sun melted across the horizon like tallow, Bjorn summoned Freydis. It had been weeks since he had touched her. He said nothing, just opened the door to his chamber and waited. She entered, her chin high, her mouth calm. They did not speak. When he laid her down, it was with a kind of reverence, but also confusion, as if trying to remember a prayer half forgotten. She closed her eyes, let him inside her, and imagined Runa's hands on her skin. Her pleasure was silent. Her body did not betray her, but her soul, somewhere between thigh and tongue, curled away. After Bjorn slept, Freydis sat up, staring into the dark. She felt no satisfaction, no victory, only the heat beneath her skin, a restless, unnamed ache. She pressed her fingers to her belly, not to bless it, but to curse its silence. Somewhere beyond the village, thunder rolled. The storm was not yet here, but it had already begun. It was a small thing, a single golden hair, long and unmistakably Fradies's, curled like a thread of sun atop the morning bread. Runa found it as she sliced the loaf for Bjorn, her hand pausing mid-cut. She stared at it for a moment, not with disgust, but with a stillness too sharp to be called calm. Then she picked it up, placed it on her tongue, and swallowed. The act was deliberate, a ritual in miniature. No one saw it, but the heat it carried sank into her ribs and stayed. Fridas, across the longhouse, kneaded more dough, her sleeves rolled high, arms dusted with flour. She did not look up, but she felt it, the moment of ingestion, the spell cast in silence. There had been no charm, no hex, only a challenge, passed between mouths instead of knives. Bjorn was distracted. The crops had failed in 2 fields, and he had begun speaking of raiding again, of sailing west to reclaim what the land had refused. He sharpened weapons with the younger men, tested their grips, and corrected their stances with the intimacy of someone who had broken and buried both friends and enemies. But at home, he drifted. He touched Runa less. Fridas, not at all. His body grew taut with restlessness, and in his absence, the women returned to their center. That night, Runa braided Fradies's hair. Neither spoke. The movements were slow, tender, purposeful, not an offering, not a seduction, but a remembrance. They sat by the hearth, the braid growing longer with each moment, hands finding rhythm in the heat. When Fridas turned, their faces close, Runa leaned in. They did not kiss. They simply touched foreheads, breath to breath, like warriors before a final march. The next morning, Bjorn awoke alone. The sheets were cold. In the kitchen, 2 cups of goat's milk sat untouched, side by side. And on the table, a braid of bread waited, thick, golden, and warm, with 1 long hair baked into its crust. There was a spindle in the corner, worn smooth by years of use. Once, it had belonged to Bjorn's mother. Now it sat mostly untouched, though the women sometimes wound threads from old tunics or torn cloaks. Fridas began using it again, not for need, but to hear the sound. The soft whir of wood, the stretch of fiber, the breath-like rhythm that echoed sleep and sex and sorrow. She spun in the evenings, her fingers deft, her face serene. Runa watched at first, seated nearby, weaving baskets or grinding grain. Then one evening, Fridas beckoned. "Sit here," she said, patting the space beside her. Runa obeyed, wordless. Fridas guided her hands to the spindle, corrected her posture, wrapped her fingers with wool. The intimacy was so quiet it made the air ache. As the thread grew longer, Runa spoke. Slowly, of her mother's songs, of the way her father smelled like fish and pine, of the boy she once kissed behind a granary and how his teeth had chipped. Fridas listened, her eyes never leaving Runa's hands. "You don't love him," Runa said, finally. It was not a question. Fridas shook her head. "And you?" she asked. Runa's lips parted, but no answer came. Only the whir of the spindle, spinning truth from silence. That night, they did not return to Bjorn's bed. He waited, listening to the wind outside, the shifting of beams in the roof, the breathing of a house that no longer pulsed for him. He rose once, went to the hearth, and saw the spindle still warm. No voices, no laughter, only the thread, coiled in a bowl, soft and unfinished, like a thought left in the mouth. Upstairs, beneath thinner furs, Fridas and Runa lay side by side. They did not touch, but their breath fell in time, their thighs brushed beneath wool, and their hands found each other in the dark. The thread had not broken, it had only changed color. Bjorn began to sleep more deeply. Whether it was the mead or the fatigue of disappointment, no one asked. But he no longer stirred at the creak of footsteps or the whisper of furs shifting. He did not ask where the women slept, nor why their scent no longer lingered near him in the morning. He simply pulled the pelts over his shoulder and turned his back to the world. Fridas slipped a knife beneath her pillow. A small one, curved, silver, meant for herbs or cutting leather. Not for protection. Not yet. It was the weight that mattered. Something cool, sharp, honest, lying close to her cheek while dreams burned around her. Runa saw it once and said nothing. She simply placed a sprig of rowan under her own blanket, for luck or for courage, or perhaps just because she knew what came next. The days moved slowly. Fridas and Runa worked in rhythm again, not out of obligation, but from a quiet understanding. They tended the goats, mended the torn hem of an older wife's dress, and scrubbed the benches after meals. No one noticed how their hands brushed too often, how their silences matched, how their presence had become a kind of gravity in the longhouse, subtle but undeniable. Even Bjorn felt it, though he could not name the shift. One evening, while carving new spear shafts, he looked at them from across the room. Fridas sat on the floor, combing Runa's hair. Runa, eyes closed, leaned into the touch with the softness of someone who had forgotten fear. Bjorn did not speak, but something old in him stirred, not jealousy, not rage, but something simpler, exclusion. For the first time, he was no longer the center of the house. He was its shadow. That night, as he lay alone, he reached beneath the furs, expecting warmth. His hand found only fabric, and then the sharp bite of the knife's edge. He did not flinch. He left it there, and for the first time, he dreamt of a house without walls, where women laughed in a language he did not know. It started with smoke, not the scent of hearth fire or food, but something sweeter, darker. The older wives noticed first, sniffing the air like wolves. Juniper, one whispered, and burnt bark. The scent came from the back room, where the dried herbs were kept. No one questioned it aloud. But the long house began to breathe differently, as if bracing. Fridas had begun burning offerings in secret, not to the gods men spoke of, but to the ones women remembered, the ones who bled with them, bore with them, hid with them in forests during times of war. She burned bits of hair, fragments of cloth, drops of her own blood, folded in bark. Runa helped. She didn't ask what the offerings meant, only that they were necessary. One night, The fire hissed too loud, and Bjorn rose from sleep. He followed the glow to the back room, barefoot, silent as snow. He saw them kneeling, Freydis with her palms open, Runa with her fingers painted red. Neither looked up. The smoke coiled around them like something alive. For a long moment, he stood there. Then he turned away. He said nothing the next day, nor the one after. But something in him retreated, a king stepping back from a throne no longer his. The villagers began to whisper, not about the women, but about the mood. Animals born dead, a child feverish for days, fish refusing the nets. Something is shifting, they said. The house is too still. When Bjorn passed in the market, people averted their gaze, not out of fear, but uncertainty. His power, once bone deep, now felt borrowed. And the women? They walked like high-born daughters, hips firm, mouths calm, eyes heavy with flame. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Freydis and Runa sat close, legs folded, hands resting in their laps. They said no prayers. They made no vows. But in the silence between breaths, the fire listened. And it waited, not for destruction, but for the moment someone would dare to name it. The dogs began howling at night, not the sharp bark of warning, but the low guttural cry of something ancient, grief or knowing. At first, Bjorn cursed them, threw bone scraps to distract, but the howling continued, always after the fire had dimmed, always when the house grew quiet enough for truths to rise from beneath the floorboards. Freydis dreamed of a wolf, black as ash, eyes pale, breath steaming like the forge. It stood in the woods outside the village, unmoving, its gaze fixed on the longhouse. In the dream, Runa was beside her, holding a lantern that flickered but never died. "He's waiting," she whispered. "Not for us. For what we're about to do." Freydis woke with sweat down her spine and a thread of blood between her thighs, not from her womb, but from a cut on her palm she didn't remember receiving. Bjorn noticed the shift in the light, the way shadows lingered longer on the beams, how his own reflection in the iron kettle seemed less solid. He began to drink more, to speak louder, to touch Freydis in passing, as if to test her warmth. She responded with a smile so soft it hurt to see. Runa, he avoided, perhaps by choice, perhaps by instinct. Her silence had grown denser, like peat, rich, ready to burn, but still. The older wives stayed near the fire, their hands busy with mending, their eyes sharp with memory. One night, one of them told a story of a woman who sang a child into forgetting its own name. She did it with love, the wife said, so he wouldn't remember who his father was. No one laughed. Runa looked up, and for a moment, the longhouse was a cage made of stories, every beam a bone, every corner an ear. And the wolf? He came again, not in dreams, but in prints left in mud near the door, too large for a dog, too precise for a storm. Freydis knelt by them at dawn, her fingers brushing the soil. When Runa joined her, they did not speak. They simply followed the tracks with their eyes, until they vanished into the trees, or into something deeper, something waiting to be unleashed. The sea called that week. The wind turned, the gulls screamed closer to shore, and the men spoke of tides and ships and hunger that could no longer be ignored. Bjorn gathered the young ones, oiled the sails, counted weapons with a fire he hadn't shown in months. "We sail in 3 nights," he declared, "west, toward harvest." But the women heard another meaning: retreat. He would leave the house, and whatever it had become, behind. That night, he took Runa to bed, not with passion, not even with intent, with insistence, with a weight that sought to reclaim what had already slipped through his fingers. Runa lay beneath him, her body still, her breath shallow. Her eyes stayed open, staring at the beams above, where a crack in the wood looked like a river branching in two. She did not cry. She did not move. When he finished, he kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but to see a different sky. Fridas found her after, not in pity, but in ritual. She brought a bowl of salt water, warmed with nettles, and a cloth woven by her mother. She bathed Runa slowly, hands firm, face expressionless. "You are not his," she whispered. "You were never his." Runa didn't answer, but she reached out, fingers curling into Freydis's wrist, anchoring herself back into her body. The water cooled. The cloth turned pink, and something between them reignited, not desire but clarity. They did not speak of revenge. That word had too many teeth. But they spoke of memory, of leaving behind no scent for men to follow. Freydis braided Runa's hair again, tighter this time. A braid for travel. A braid for beginnings. Outside, the wind hissed against the shutters like breath through clenched teeth. The sea was close. When Bjorn woke, the house was empty, the hearth cold, the furs untouched. Only a bowl remained on the bed, salt water, now still, with a single hair floating at its center. Not a farewell, not a threat, just truth distilled. They left before the sky turned blue, just before dawn, that hour where shadows have not yet chosen form. Runa carried only what could be worn or hidden: herbs wrapped in linen, a carved comb, a strand of red thread tucked beneath her tongue. Freydis carried the weight of decision, pressed between her ribs like a blade never drawn. They walked in silence through the trees, feet soft against moss, the world holding its breath. The old fisherman owed Freydis a favor. Years ago, she had tended to his daughter's birthing wound, stitched her with thread soaked in honey and firewater. He did not ask why they came now, only pointed to the small skiff tied to the dock, its hull worn but watertight. "It needs no name," he said, voice graveled. "Just wind." Runa bowed her head. Freydis met his eyes and nodded once, a thank you and a goodbye. They pushed off together, hands steady, bodies leaning in rhythm. The lake was still, except for the ripple of their wake. Runa turned once, watching the village disappear behind pines and mist. "He will follow," she whispered. Freydis didn't look back. then let him follow the wrong wind. Their fingers met on the oar, not in reassurance, in pact, a silent contract carved in skin. By midday, they reached the fjord's mouth. Salt rose in the air, gulls cried above, and far ahead, the sea waited, grey, wide, unknowable. The world was no longer made of walls and hearths, but of tides and hunger. Freydis had never sailed beyond the coast. Runa had never steered a boat. Yet they moved like they had always been meant for water, for leaving. On the shore behind them, the trees remained still. But something had shifted. Not a chase, not yet, but a knowing. The long house had exhaled, and in its silence, the fire no longer warmed. It watched. They made camp by a ring of stones near the cliffs, where others had once stayed, lovers, fugitives, traders between borders. The earth was scorched from old flames, and the bones of small fish still scattered near the shore. Runa gathered driftwood. Freydis found berries, some bitter, some sweet. They built their fire small, with care, as if afraid that even the light might betray their presence. "Name it," Runa said, gesturing to the flames. Freydis tilted her head. "The fire." Runa nodded. "If we are to be women without masters, the fire must belong to us." Freydis thought for a long moment. Then Lifa. It meant to remain, in a tongue older than their own. Runa smiled. "Then let it burn as we do." They fed the fire slowly, whispering to it like a child. Later, beneath the sky stretched open like a wound, they lay side by side. No furs, no ritual, no watching eyes. Freydis pressed her lips to Runa's neck, not with hunger, but with reverence. Runa's hands trembled against her ribs. They moved like memory and longing, bodies rediscovering themselves through each other. It was not passion, it was return. The way water remembers the riverbed, even after drought. After, they spoke of the future, not in plans, but in possibilities. "A place with chickens," Runa said, "and goats. And no men." Freydis asked. Runa hesitated. "Only those who've forgotten how to own." Freydis laughed softly, her breath warm on Runa's shoulder. "Then it will be a village of ghosts." The fire crackled beside them, steady and low. Lifa. The warmth did not fade. It claimed nothing, asked nothing. It simply stayed. As dawn approached, they did not sleep. They watched the horizon instead, where clouds moved like sails, and the sea whispered promises not yet broken. The sea was wider here, not in measure, but in meaning. It no longer carried ships. It carried memory, of feet in cold sand, of cries between sails, of hands wrapped in salt and goodbye. Freydis and Runa moved slowly now, not out of caution, but reverence. Each step forward was a shedding, of obedience, of names, of the woman each had been beneath another's gaze. Their skin began to change, not visibly, no wounds, no marks, but in texture. Fridas noticed first, while washing near a tide pool. Her arms no longer flinched from the cold. Her feet no longer ached on stone. It was as if the world had redrawn her outline, as if her body had agreed to be her own. She looked at Runa across the water, and saw not the girl who once trembled beneath Bjorn's weight, but something else. A woman made of dusk and resistance. They followed a stream inland, thin and silver, like a scar across the earth. It led them to a hollow between two hills, where the grass grew taller and the birds sang low, unfamiliar songs. They built no fire that night. Instead, they lay wrapped in cloaks listening, to the wind in the reeds, to each other's breath, to the heartbeat that lived in both of them, as if they shared a single pulse stretched across two chests. "I dreamt of you," Runa whispered, "before I met you. I didn't know it was you, but you smelled like smoke and milk. And your eyes, they were angry but soft." Fridas smiled without opening her eyes. "I was angry. I still am." A pause. "But now I don't know at who." Runa reached over, traced her fingers along Freydis's cheek, maybe at the silence. Freydis nodded, or maybe at how easily we survived without being asked what it cost. The stars above them blurred into breath. The earth exhaled, and the river near their feet murmured on, not forward, not back, but around, as if the world itself had begun to forget straight lines and remembered only spirals. They spoke of building again, not with logs or walls, but with time. A place where women don't have to look over their shoulder before laughing, Runa said. Freydis added, a place where touch isn't owed, only offered. The house they imagined had no corners, no locks, just a roof low enough to feel safe beneath, and high enough to breathe dreams into. By then, their hands had learned each other's language by heart. Runa's fingers could find Freydis's pulse in the dark without searching. Freydis could draw maps of Runa's back in the sand, from shoulder to spine, from breath to bone. The intimacy had softened, deepened. It was no longer a rebellion. It was simply life, quiet, complete, unspectacular in the way that real love always is when finally left alone. One afternoon, while foraging, they found a cave veiled by moss. Inside, the air smelled of stone and damp memory. On the wall someone, long ago, had carved a spiral. Nothing more. No animal. No god. Just a curl of line, looping inward. They touched it together, palms flat against the wall. And in that still moment, they realized they were not the first. They would not be the last. Others had walked, loved, fled, forgotten, and the land remembered all of it. They decided not to return to the village. Not now, perhaps not ever, not for fear, but because they had already built something more lasting than houses, a rhythm, a way of moving through the world, a softness that resisted the hardness of what had come before. If no one ever speaks our names again, Freydis said, would it mean we disappeared? Runa shook her head. No, It would mean we became the kind of silence that teaches instead of punishes. That night, they did not speak. They lay side by side, watching the wind comb through tall grass outside the cave. The spiral above them caught the moonlight, and the house they had imagined, the one with no corners, no locks, bloomed quietly beneath their ribs, room by room, dream by dream. It was not a scent, but a temperature, the memory of heat on skin. That was how Fridas knew the season had changed. The nights grew longer again, but not colder. The air brushed her with the gentleness of something that no longer needed to prove itself. When she touched the stones warmed by the midday sun, they held a pulse, as if the land had begun to breathe with them. Runa gathered lavender from a patch between the cliffs, her hands stained purple by dusk and oil. She moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but reverence. The flowers were for no ritual, no offering, just comfort. She placed a bundle by their bed of moss, and the scent lingered in their hair, their dreams, the folds behind their knees. "Do you ever forget him?" she asked one night, not bitter, not sad. Fridas lay still. "No, but I no longer remember the part of me that belonged to him." They began writing on each other's bodies, not with ink, but with fingers dipped in clay and berry juice. Runes of their own design, shapes that had no meaning outside the space between collarbone and thigh. On Runa's stomach, Fridas drew a spiral that bloomed into branches. On Freydis's ribs, Runa painted a line of waves that curved into flame. The marks washed away with each bath, but the skin remembered. The heat remained. Sometimes they made love in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. Their mouths pressed into wrists, into scars, into the back of knees. Their rhythm was not of hunger. It was of knowing, of having returned again and again to the same door, and finally being invited inside. Each climax was soft, like water folding into itself. No thunder, only tide. The fire they built at night was smaller now, not because they needed less warmth, but because they no longer feared the dark. They let the flames die slowly, watched the embers fade like breath on glass. And when the night closed in around them, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like being held. The wind came early that morning, curling over the hills like a cat stretching. It moved through the grass, through their cloaks, through their hair, not as an intruder, but as a guest who had always known the way in. Fridas stood facing it, arms outstretched, eyes closed. Runa watched from the cave's mouth, half wrapped in their shared blanket, and smiled. "You look like a woman waiting for a god." Fridas turned slightly. "No," she said, "I look like a god waiting for herself." They walked to the edge of the cliff where the sea met stone with slow ceremonial waves. Beneath them, foam danced like breath. The world felt open, unmapped. "If we wanted," Runa said, "we could keep walking. Forever." Fridas nodded. "But then we'd forget where we started." "Would that be bad?" "No," Fridas answered. but I want to carry the beginning inside me, so I know what I survived. A falcon flew above them, circling once before vanishing into the sky. Neither woman spoke, but both felt it, the presence of something watching, not with judgment, but with memory. A reminder that not all witnesses are human, that some truths are kept in feathers, in wind, in bone. Runa knelt and traced a rune into the earth with her fingertip, a simple line, then a hook, the symbol for release. They returned to the cave and began packing slowly, not in haste, not in fear, with care, like two people leaving behind a sacred place, but carrying its light in their chests. Where will we go? Runa asked. Friedis shrugged. Wherever the silence tastes different. That night, they did not sleep. They sat awake, listening, not to danger, but to possibility. When the wind returned, it whispered no names. It asked for nothing. It only passed through the cave, between their bodies, across the sleeping fire. And in that breath, the world reminded them, the wind has no master, and neither do you. There is a silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the completion of it, like a song that ends exactly where it should. Friedis and Runa had reached that silence. It lived in the way they moved without words, in the glances exchanged between gestures, in the breath shared across a fire not yet lit. The cave was still, but not empty. It was full of presence, the kind that does not ask to be seen. That morning, they walked to the estuary, where fresh water met salt, and both forgot what they once were. Friedis knelt in the shallows, cupping the brackish tide, letting it run over her arms, her throat, her face. Runa did the same, not as ritual, not as farewell, as instinct, like animals knowing when to molt. The water took the scent of the longhouse from their skin, the voices of men, the ache of obedience. They watched it flow away, golden and dusted with ash. They spoke their names aloud, one final time, not to affirm, to release. Friedis, she said, as if spitting out the last bite of something too long chewed. Runa, whispered the other, voice soft but steady. Then silence. The names floated for a moment, then vanished into the current, as if the water had always been hungry for them. What remained were their bodies, yes, but even those felt new. Unnamed, untamed. The day stretched wide and slow. They gathered herbs not for healing, but for color, rubbed ochre into each other's skin, drew new marks, not runes, not spells, but movements made visible. A curl above the left breast, a line across the shoulder blade, dots where a hand once held too tightly. They laughed at the shapes. We look like stories no one's written yet, Runa said. Friedis kissed her. Then let's never end them. And as the sun began to fall, casting long shadows that reached but never touched, they lay together beneath the tall reeds, fingers interlaced, hearts unhurried. The wind passed above them, and the earth below them held steady. Their bodies sank deeper into the world, not buried, rooted, and the river, tireless and tender, carried their names far from where they could be used against them. It was Fridas who heard it first, not a sound, but a feeling, a low hum beneath the soil. The way silence changes when something is about to arrive. They had grown attuned to these shifts, not in fear, but in respect. The world, after all, had its own memory. It echoed not in words, but in air pressure, in the stillness of animals, in the sudden silence of trees. They packed slowly, carefully, not as if fleeing, but as if answering a call not made with tongues. They walked west that day, following no trail, only the softness beneath their feet. The grass changed color as they moved, greener, then gray, then the shade of old parchment. The sky stretched above them like fabric left in the sun too long. Birds flew high, but never circled. Time seemed to thin. At one point, Runa asked, "Have we walked 1 hour or 10? Fridas smiled, eyes unfocused. Maybe both. Maybe none. By afternoon, they found a clearing with no entrance, no exit. Just space. And light. Not golden, not blue, but the color of old milk, of breath caught in a throat, of dreams before sleep. They sat, then lay, then curled into each other like roots reuniting underground. There were no more stories to share, only warmth, only pulse, only the quiet certainty that nothing more needed to happen. Around them, the world softened. The wind lost its edge. The insects stopped buzzing. Even the fire within them, once bright and urgent, now flickered like candlelight in a closed room. Runa turned her head and whispered, "Do you think they'll forget us?" Fridas, eyes closed, replied, "Only if we ask them to." Then, after a pause, she added, "And maybe that's the gift." The trees did not watch. The stones did not judge. But somewhere between their joined palms and the hush that followed, the world absorbed them gently, not as martyrs, not as legends, simply as women who remembered how to leave, women who let go without disappearing, women who became part of the silence and gave it shape. They did not know when they fell asleep, only that they woke inside the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. The light was different now, not dawn, not dusk, a silver that hummed without source, like the inside of a shell held close to the ear. Fridas stirred first, fingers still tangled with Runa's. Her body was warm, her breath slow. For a long while, she did not move. She only listened, to the hush, to the nothing, to the everything inside the nothing. Runa opened her eyes and smiled, not because something was funny, but because her face remembered how to. The smile spread like warmth through her chest, down her ribs, across her belly. She reached for Fradis's face, not to awaken her, not to hold her, just to know that her hand could still make contact. Their foreheads touched. Their lips didn't. There was no need. Everything had already been spoken in the space between breath. Around them, the clearing seemed to pulse softly. Grass swayed without wind. The earth beneath them felt hollow and infinite, like a cave with no walls. Somewhere nearby, water moved, not a river, not a stream, just the sound of movement itself, as if time had chosen to wear water's voice for a while. They did not rise. They did not speak. They let the sound carry them inward, deeper, softer. And when their bodies at last grew too light to remain, when skin gave way to air, and air to memory, and memory to quiet, they did not resist. Freydis's last thought was not of Bjorn, nor of blood, nor of flame. It was of Runa's hair brushing her shoulder on the first morning they woke side by side. Runa's last breath was not exhaled. It simply lingered, suspended, then settled into the earth like mist returning home. No one came looking for them. No stories were told in the village. No statues carved. But sometimes in the hush between waves, or in the scent of lavender left too long in sun, the world remembers something, a warmth, a shape, a sigh. And somewhere still beneath moss and silence, a clearing holds the trace of two women who left nothing behind, except the breath that stayed.